What if everything you've been taught about hypnosis is incomplete? Most people imagine hypnosis as a mysterious technique used to control another person's thoughts, override their decisions, or somehow gain power over their mind. But what if the greatest secret isn't about controlling someone else at all? What if the real process begins with transforming your own consciousness first? This single idea completely changes the meaning of influence, and it lies surprisingly close to the way Jacobo Grinberg explored the nature of human awareness. Throughout his investigations into consciousness, perception, and the invisible structures that connect reality, Grinberg repeatedly pointed toward something extraordinary: the possibility that our minds are not isolated inside our skulls, but participate in a much larger informational field. If that possibility is even partially true, then influencing another person is no longer a matter of force or manipulation. Instead, it becomes a question of resonance, coherence, and the invisible quality of your own mental state. Today we're going to explore this fascinating perspective step by step. You'll discover why some individuals naturally command attention without raising their voice. You'll understand why certain people completely change the emotional atmosphere of a room the moment they enter it. You'll also learn why genuine influence may have far less to do with persuasive words than with the invisible organization of consciousness itself. And by the end of this video, you'll see why mastering your own mind could be the closest thing to what many people mistakenly call hypnotizing another person. Stay with me until the very end, because the final insight may completely change the way you understand human interaction, perception, and the hidden potential of consciousness itself. Before we begin, I'd like to invite you to participate in today's discussion. Leave a comment sharing one sentence that reflects the state of mind you want to strengthen in your own life. It could be something simple like, "My mind remains calm. I choose clarity over fear," or any statement that genuinely represents your intention. Reading how people from around the world describe the consciousness they wish to cultivate creates an incredible space for reflection. If you enjoy exploring topics like consciousness, perception, and the extraordinary ideas of Jacobo Grinberg, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and leave a like so this video can reach more curious minds. And if you'd like to directly support our work and help us continue producing in-depth explorations like this one, consider using Super Chat during the premiere or live session. Your support allows this community to continue growing. Now imagine walking into a room where two strangers are quietly talking. Before either of them says a single word to you, you immediately sense tension. No one appears angry. There is no obvious conflict. Yet something inside you instantly recognizes that the atmosphere feels heavy. On another day, you enter a completely different place. The people there are also strangers, but this time you immediately feel relaxed. You cannot explain exactly why. The room simply feels welcoming. Your breathing slows down naturally, your shoulders relax, and your thoughts become calmer. What actually happened in those two situations? Conventional psychology would point toward body language, facial expressions, tone of voice, and countless unconscious social cues. Those explanations certainly describe part of the experience, but Jacobo Grinberg believed there was something even deeper taking place beneath ordinary perception. According to his ideas, consciousness continuously interacts with a larger informational field from which our experience of reality emerges. This means that perception may begin long before our conscious mind starts analyzing external information. Instead of merely observing other people through our senses, our awareness may already be responding to subtle patterns generated by their internal state. If this is true, then influence begins far earlier than speech. It begins before words, before gestures, and perhaps even before conscious thought itself. Consider someone whose presence naturally inspires confidence. They don't dominate conversations. They don't constantly seek attention. They don't appear desperate to convince anyone of anything. Yet people listen when they speak. Others trust them almost immediately. Their calmness seems contagious. Where does that influence come from? From Grinberg's perspective, the answer is surprisingly simple. Their thoughts, emotions, expectations, and attention operate in remarkable coherence. There is very little internal contradiction. Their consciousness functions like a perfectly tuned instrument rather than a chaotic collection of competing impulses. That coherence may be what other minds unconsciously perceive. Now think about moments in your own life. Have you ever entered an important conversation already feeling anxious? You tried to hide your nervousness, smiled normally, chose your words carefully, yet somehow the interaction still felt awkward. It was as if the other person sensed something you never actually expressed. Then remember another situation when you felt completely centered. Without rehearsing anything, the conversation flowed naturally. Ideas appeared effortlessly. The other person seemed more open, more receptive, more comfortable. What changed? Not your vocabulary, not your intelligence, not your appearance, only your internal state. Grinberg would likely argue that this internal organization is never confined to the private world of your own mind. It participates in the larger field through which perception itself is continuously constructed. That possibility completely transforms what people usually imagine hypnosis to be. Rather than forcing another consciousness into submission, genuine influence may arise because an organized mind naturally invites organization in those around it. Instead of imposing ideas upon someone else, your own coherence subtly reshapes the psychological space shared between both individuals. And perhaps this is the greatest misunderstanding surrounding the concept of hypnotizing another person. Popular culture has taught us to associate hypnosis with domination, secret commands, or irresistible control. Movies have portrayed hypnotists as individuals capable of erasing free will with a few carefully chosen words. But Grinberg's vision points in an entirely different direction. The deepest influence does not emerge from overpowering another mind. It emerges from cultivating such extraordinary clarity within yourself that your very presence begins to transform the quality of human interaction. In this sense, the first mind you ever learn to hypnotize is your own. Only then does your consciousness become capable of creating a different experience for everyone who comes into contact with it. One of the most fascinating aspects of Jacobo Grinberg's work is that he never encouraged people to chase mysterious powers for the sake of impressing others. In fact, if we examine the direction of his ideas carefully, we discover that extraordinary influence is almost always a byproduct of extraordinary self-organization. This is completely opposite to the mindset of someone desperately trying to manipulate another person. The manipulator operates from lack. They constantly wonder what to say, how to behave, what expression to make, what words will produce the desired reaction. Their attention remains trapped outside themselves, searching for control. Meanwhile, the individual whose consciousness has become deeply coherent no longer needs to calculate every interaction. Their influence emerges naturally because their attention is no longer fragmented. Imagine standing beside a perfectly calm lake early in the morning. The surface reflects the mountains, the trees, and the sky with astonishing precision because nothing disturbs the water. Now imagine throwing dozens of stones into that same lake every few seconds. The reflections disappear. The image becomes distorted. The surroundings have not changed at all. Only the condition of the water has changed. Grinberg often explored consciousness in a similar way. Reality itself may remain constant, while the state of awareness determines how accurately it can perceive and participate in that reality. This analogy also helps explain why certain individuals seem capable of influencing others without speaking very much. Their consciousness resembles the calm lake. Because there is little internal conflict, other people unconsciously experience stability simply by interacting with them. Human beings constantly respond to emotional and cognitive patterns whether they realize it or not. We mirror facial expressions without noticing. We synchronize breathing during meaningful conversations. Groups gradually align their posture, rhythm, and tone. These phenomena have been observed repeatedly within psychology and neuroscience. Grinberg simply extended the question much further. What if synchronization occurs not only through visible behavior, but also through deeper structures of consciousness? What if minds naturally seek coherence in the same way pendulums eventually synchronize their movement when connected through a shared structure? Suddenly, influence becomes something entirely different from persuasion. It becomes resonance. Consider an orchestra before a concert begins. Every musician tunes their instrument individually. If one violin remains out of tune, everyone hears the discord immediately. The conductor does not force harmony into existence. Harmony emerges because each instrument gradually aligns itself with the same reference. According to Grinberg's perspective, consciousness may function similarly. When one individual achieves exceptional internal coherence, other minds interacting with that person may naturally begin adjusting toward greater stability without consciously realizing why. This could explain why spending time with certain people leaves us energized, while spending time with others leaves us emotionally exhausted. Their internal organization influences the quality of shared experience. You have probably experienced this yourself. Think about someone who remains calm even during difficult situations. Perhaps a teacher, a grandparent, a mentor, or simply a friend whose presence always seems reassuring. When problems appeared, they rarely panicked. Instead, they maintained remarkable composure. Eventually, everyone around them also became calmer. Nothing magical happened. No secret hypnosis techniques were involved. Yet their state spread through the environment almost like an invisible rhythm that others naturally followed. Now compare that with someone consumed by anxiety. They enter a room, and within minutes, everyone begins feeling restless. Conversations become hurried. Decisions become impulsive. Small problems suddenly feel enormous. Again, very few words may have been exchanged. The atmosphere changed because consciousness itself appeared to organize experience differently. This is precisely why Grinberg emphasized observation over reaction. Most people believe they are responding objectively to the world. In reality, they are often responding to interpretations generated by an unstable internal state. Every fear creates a filter. Every expectation modifies perception. Every unresolved emotional pattern colors the information reaching awareness. If your own consciousness constantly shifts between excitement, fear, anger, doubt, and insecurity, then your influence also becomes inconsistent. Others unconsciously perceive that instability, not because they can read your thoughts, but because coherence, or the absence of it, reveals itself through countless subtle channels simultaneously. This leads to another profound misunderstanding about influencing another mind. Many assume influence depends upon convincing arguments, yet history repeatedly demonstrates that people often follow individuals long before carefully analyzing what those individuals actually say. Confidence attracts attention. Clarity inspires trust. Emotional stability creates psychological safety. These qualities cannot be convincingly faked for long because they emerge from the deeper architecture of consciousness rather than temporary performance. Imagine two speakers delivering exactly the same message. They use identical words, identical timing, even identical gestures. Yet one captivates the audience while the other leaves almost no impression. Why? Traditional explanations might mention charisma or communication skills. Grinberg's framework invites a deeper possibility. Perhaps the audience is responding not merely to language but to the overall coherence of the speaker's consciousness. The words become only one small component of a much larger transmission. This also explains why attempts at manipulation often fail, despite sophisticated techniques. Someone may memorize persuasive scripts, practice hypnotic language patterns, or study advanced methods of influence. But if fear remains underneath every sentence, if insecurity drives every interaction, if hidden desperation fuels every action, then those deeper patterns quietly contradict the spoken message. Consciousness communicates far more than vocabulary ever could. The remarkable implication is that anyone seeking to influence others should first become a student of their own attention. Notice where your thoughts repeatedly return throughout the day. Observe how quickly your emotions react to external circumstances. Ask yourself whether your inner dialogue creates harmony or constant contradiction. Every repeated mental pattern strengthens the architecture through which consciousness interprets reality. Over weeks, months, and years, those patterns become the invisible signature others experience whenever they interact with you. Grinberg believed perception itself emerges through participation. We do not simply observe reality from outside. We continuously help construct the experience we call reality through consciousness. If so, then every interaction between two people becomes a meeting between two living fields of organization. Neither remains completely unchanged afterward. Both contribute to the quality of the shared experience. From this perspective, influencing another person is never a one-way process. It is a dynamic exchange shaped by the clarity, coherence, and stability each individual brings into that encounter. The person whose consciousness remains more organized often becomes the reference point around which the interaction naturally stabilizes. That is why mastering yourself is not merely personal development. It becomes the foundation for every meaningful relationship, every conversation, every act of leadership, and every moment in which another human being quietly senses something extraordinary about your presence without ever fully understanding why. If Grinberg's perspective is correct, then one of the greatest mistakes people make is believing that influence begins the moment they start speaking. In reality, the process may begin much earlier, perhaps hours before the conversation even takes place. Every thought you repeatedly entertain, every emotional pattern you reinforce, every expectation you cultivate gradually shapes the state of consciousness you eventually bring into the interaction. By the time you finally stand in front of another person, much of the exchange has already been prepared within you. This idea sounds almost unbelievable until we observe our own daily experience. Think about how differently you perceive the world after waking up from a peaceful night's sleep compared to waking after hours of anxiety and mental exhaustion. The same street looks different. The same conversations feel different. Even ordinary events seem to carry a completely different emotional weight. The external world remains almost identical, yet your experience changes dramatically because consciousness itself has changed. Grinberg suggested that reality is not simply received passively by the mind. Instead, consciousness actively participates in constructing the experience we call reality. If perception itself depends upon our internal organization, then every relationship becomes a reflection of that same principle. We never meet another person with a neutral mind. We always arrive carrying a complete architecture of expectations, memories, emotions, beliefs, and assumptions. Imagine two individuals meeting for the very first time. One enters the room expecting rejection. The other enters expecting genuine connection. Their behavior immediately begins to diverge, even if neither person consciously intends it. The first hesitates before speaking, interprets silence as criticism, searches for signs of disapproval, and unconsciously reinforces their original expectation. The second smiles naturally, remains curious, interprets pauses calmly, and notices opportunities for connection instead of threats. Both people experience the same meeting, yet each constructed an entirely different reality. Which version was objectively true? Perhaps neither, or perhaps both. According to Grinberg's framework, consciousness is never merely observing reality. It is participating in its continuous formation. This realization transforms the entire concept of mental influence. Instead of asking, "How do I change another person's mind?" a far more meaningful question emerges. What kind of consciousness am I bringing into this shared experience? Notice how radically different those questions are. The first seeks control, the second seeks coherence. The first assumes that power exists outside you. The second recognizes that every interaction begins with the invisible order, or disorder, already present within your own awareness. This may explain why some individuals repeatedly attract similar relationships throughout their lives. They often believe they are simply unlucky. They blame circumstances, other people, timing, or coincidence. Yet if their consciousness continuously organizes experience through the same assumptions, then similar patterns naturally reappear. They are not consciously choosing those experiences, but neither are they entirely separate from the process that generates them. Grinberg was deeply interested in how perception itself could become transformed. He did not simply ask how reality works. He asked how consciousness creates the experience of reality. This distinction is subtle, yet it changes everything. Most scientific investigations attempt to study objects. Grinberg often focused on the observer. What happens when the observer changes? Does reality itself appear different because external circumstances changed or because consciousness now organizes information differently? This question has fascinated philosophers for centuries, yet Grinberg attempted to approach it through both scientific inquiry and direct experience. One of the most intriguing aspects of his work involves the idea that consciousness may function less like a storage device and more like an active participant continuously selecting, organizing, and giving meaning to information. Imagine listening to an orchestra performing dozens of instruments simultaneously. If your attention focuses entirely on the violin, you may barely notice the flute. Shift your attention toward the percussion, and suddenly, an entirely different musical experience emerges. The orchestra never changed. Only the organization of attention changed. Grinberg believed consciousness may operate in a remarkably similar way. Reality presents an immeasurable amount of information at every moment, yet awareness organizes only a tiny fraction into conscious experience. The implications are extraordinary. If attention determines experience, then whoever masters attention gradually masters perception. And whoever masters perception begins transforming the quality of every interaction. This does not mean controlling another person's thoughts. It means becoming so internally organized that your perception no longer creates unnecessary distortion. Think about moments when fear completely changed the meaning of ordinary events. A delayed text message suddenly felt like rejection. A neutral facial expression appeared hostile. A brief silence became evidence that something was wrong. Later, you discovered that nothing had happened at all. The entire emotional experience emerged because your consciousness temporarily organized reality through the lens of fear. The same mechanism also works in the opposite direction. Someone whose consciousness remains deeply centered often discovers opportunities where others only perceive obstacles. They notice possibilities hidden beneath apparent limitations. They remain creative during uncertainty because their perception has not collapsed into panic. This difference eventually becomes visible to everyone around them. Without trying to dominate anyone, they become a stabilizing presence. Others begin asking for their advice. Their opinions carry unusual weight. Their calmness quietly influences entire groups. Not because they possess supernatural powers, but because coherence itself becomes contagious. There is another fascinating observation worth considering. The more desperately someone tries to influence another person, the weaker their influence often becomes. Desperation fragments attention. It divides consciousness between fear of failure and hope for success. Every sentence becomes loaded with hidden anxiety. Every gesture seeks validation. Ironically, this inner conflict weakens the very presence they hope to strengthen. Compare that with someone who no longer needs a particular outcome in order to feel complete. Their attention remains relaxed. They genuinely listen. They respond naturally instead of calculating every word. Paradoxically, these individuals often become far more influential precisely because they are no longer obsessed with influencing anyone. Their consciousness has become unified rather than divided. Perhaps this is one of the deepest lessons hidden within Grinberg's work. Real influence cannot be manufactured through performance alone. It emerges from profound alignment between thought, emotion, attention, and awareness. When those elements move together without contradiction, something remarkable happens. Other people begin responding not only to your words, but to the quality of consciousness from which those words arise. And that invisible quality may be far more powerful than anything language could ever communicate by itself. Now we arrive at one of the most mysterious and controversial aspects of Jacobo Grinberg's ideas. If consciousness truly participates in a shared informational field, then every thought you repeatedly cultivate becomes more than a private mental event. It becomes part of the structure through which you continuously interact with reality itself. This does not necessarily mean that thoughts magically force other people to obey your wishes. Grinberg never reduced consciousness to simplistic formulas. Instead, he proposed something far more sophisticated. Consciousness appears to organize experience by shaping the way information becomes available to awareness. The deeper your internal coherence, the more organized your interaction with reality becomes. Imagine tuning an old radio. Hundreds of frequencies already exist in the air around you, yet you hear only the station your receiver is capable of selecting. The music was always there. Your receiver simply wasn't aligned with that particular frequency until the adjustment was made. Grinberg often described consciousness in a way that resembles this analogy. Reality may contain an immeasurable amount of information simultaneously, but awareness selects only certain patterns to become conscious experience. What determines that selection? According to his ideas, one of the most important factors is the state of consciousness itself. This changes the entire conversation about influence. Suppose two people witness exactly the same event. One immediately notices opportunities. The other notices only danger. One feels inspired. The other feels defeated. Which one perceived reality correctly? Conventional thinking assumes one person must be mistaken. Grinberg invites another possibility. Each consciousness organized the available information according to its own internal structure. Their experiences became different because the observer was different. Now extend this principle into human relationships. When you meet another person, both minds bring years of accumulated assumptions, beliefs, emotional habits, expectations, memories, and unconscious patterns into a single interaction. What unfolds between them is not created solely by spoken language. It emerges from the continuous exchange between two highly organized systems of consciousness. Think about the people who naturally earn trust. They rarely rush conversations. They do not interrupt constantly. They don't appear desperate to prove themselves. Instead, they remain deeply attentive. Their presence communicates stability before their words communicate ideas. This is something many people have experienced without ever understanding why. You leave a conversation feeling unexpectedly calm, motivated, or optimistic, even though the other person never offered complicated advice. Somehow, their presence alone shifted your internal state. How does that happen? Traditional psychology offers valuable explanations involving empathy, mirror neurons, emotional regulation, and nonverbal communication. These mechanisms certainly play an important role. Grinberg, however, wondered whether these observable effects might be expressions of an even deeper process occurring beneath ordinary awareness. If consciousness itself possesses an organizing function, then coherent awareness may naturally encourage coherence within other minds. Notice that this idea does not require mystical thinking. It begins with something we already observe every day. Emotions spread through groups. Confidence spreads. Fear spreads. Laughter spreads. Panic spreads even faster. Entire crowds suddenly begin behaving as though they share one emotional system. The question Grinberg explored was whether these visible phenomena reflect a deeper level of interconnected consciousness that science has only begun to understand. This possibility becomes even more fascinating when we examine attention itself. Most people believe they control their attention. In reality, attention often controls them. A single negative thought appears. Minutes later, it becomes a story. Soon it develops into an emotional state. Hours later, that emotional state begins influencing every conversation, every decision, and every interpretation of reality. Eventually, the person no longer realizes they are viewing life through a particular mental filter. The filter becomes invisible because it has become familiar. Grinberg repeatedly emphasized direct observation. Not observation of the external world alone, but observation of consciousness itself. Can you notice a thought before believing it? Can you observe fear before reacting to it? Can you remain aware while your mind automatically constructs interpretations? These questions may appear simple, yet they point toward one of the greatest forms of freedom available to human beings. The moment you become capable of observing your own mental processes without immediately identifying with them, consciousness begins reorganizing itself. Inner coherence slowly replaces automatic reaction. This is why attempting to influence another person while remaining internally chaotic usually produces disappointing results. Imagine trying to write beautifully while someone constantly shakes your hand. The problem isn't your intelligence. The problem is instability. Now imagine your hand becoming perfectly still. The same ability suddenly expresses itself with much greater precision. Grinberg suggested something remarkably similar about consciousness. Mental noise interferes with perception. Contradictory emotions fragment attention. Compulsive thinking scatters awareness. But as internal coherence increases, perception becomes clearer. Decision-making becomes simpler. Presence becomes stronger. And influence emerges naturally rather than forcefully. This also explains why authenticity possesses such unusual power. People often assume authenticity simply means being yourself. But authentic presence goes much deeper. It means there is almost no contradiction between what you think, what you feel, what you believe, and how you act. Energy is no longer wasted maintaining multiple internal identities. Everything begins moving in the same direction. Others may not consciously recognize why they trust such individuals, yet they often do. Human consciousness appears remarkably sensitive to consistency. We instinctively recognize when someone's words and inner state align. Likewise, we unconsciously detect hidden conflict when they do not. Perhaps this is why truly influential people rarely appear obsessed with influence. They are focused instead on clarity. Their attention is no longer consumed by controlling outcomes. Instead, they become deeply committed to refining the quality of their own consciousness. Ironically, that inner refinement becomes the very source of their external impact. From Grinberg's perspective, the greatest form of influence may never involve changing another person's mind directly. Instead, it begins by becoming so internally ordered that every interaction naturally reflects that order. Like a tuning fork causing another tuning fork to vibrate without physical contact, coherent consciousness may quietly invite coherence wherever it goes. Whether we interpret this through neuroscience, psychology, philosophy, or Grinberg's more expansive theories of consciousness, one observation remains remarkably consistent. People rarely remember every word you spoke. They remember how they experienced themselves while they were with you. And perhaps that experience begins long before language ever enters the conversation. As we reach the end of this journey, notice how different the original question has become. We began by asking, how can someone hypnotize another person's mind? Yet after exploring Jacobo Grinberg's ideas, a far more meaningful question emerges. What happens when a human being learns to consciously organize their own mind? That subtle shift changes everything. Instead of seeking power over others, you begin cultivating mastery over your own awareness. Instead of chasing techniques designed to manipulate behavior, you develop the kind of inner coherence that naturally transforms every interaction you have. Whether Grinberg's theories are ultimately proven, expanded, or challenged by future discoveries, they invite us to consider something profoundly valuable. Consciousness may be far more active than we usually imagine. Every thought we repeatedly entertain, every emotion we strengthen, every belief we accept without examination, gradually becomes part of the reality we experience. If that is true, then our greatest responsibility is not to control another person's perception, but to become increasingly conscious of the patterns shaping our own. Perhaps the most remarkable influence is not convincing someone to think as you do. Perhaps it is creating a presence so calm, so centered, and so authentic that other people naturally discover greater clarity within themselves. That kind of influence leaves no feeling of manipulation. It does not remove another person's freedom. Instead, it expands the space in which both people can think more clearly. This perspective also reminds us to become more careful about what we allow into our own minds. Every repeated fear, every limiting belief, every automatic emotional reaction silently trains consciousness to interpret reality in a particular way. At the same time, every moment of awareness, every deliberate act of attention, every conscious observation without immediate judgment strengthens a different way of experiencing life. Little by little, the architecture of the mind changes. And as it changes, so does the quality of our relationships, our decisions, and our perception of the world around us. Maybe that is why Grinberg spent so much time exploring consciousness itself rather than searching for shortcuts to extraordinary abilities. The greatest mystery was never hidden somewhere outside the human being. It was always present within the observer. Every experience, every perception, every relationship begins there. Before reality becomes something we interpret, it first passes through the silent structure of awareness itself. So the next time you wonder how someone influences another person's mind, remember this conversation. The deepest influence may never come from secret words, psychological tricks, or hidden techniques. It may arise from something much simpler and much more demanding. Becoming completely present, internally coherent, and consciously aware of the quality of your own attention. When that happens, your presence begins communicating long before you speak, and your actions begin reflecting a mind that no longer reacts automatically but responds with clarity. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. If this exploration encouraged you to see consciousness from a new perspective, let me know in the comments what insight resonated with you the most. I genuinely enjoy reading your reflections because every thoughtful conversation expands this community of curious minds. If you found value in today's discussion, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who is fascinated by consciousness, perception, and the extraordinary ideas of Jacobo Grinberg. Until our next exploration, continue questioning, continue observing, and above all, never stop discovering the incredible potential hidden within your own consciousness.